Good afternoon. I'm Tom James, Provost of Teachers College, and I'd like to welcome you to the annual Sachs lecture. I'm going to tell you just a word about the lecture. After, first of all, welcoming all of you here, faculty and students of Teachers College, members of the faculty and teachers from other institutions around here, educators of all kinds who are interested in this topic. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of Susan Furman, our president, who is here with us. And we're delighted that Pam Grossman, our Sachs lecturer, is here. I'll say a little bit more about her in a minute. The Julia and Rosa Sachs lecture has been at Teachers College since 1930. And it's a series of lectures over the years that has brought distinguished educators here to talk to us about future directions in education. It's a chance for our community to receive new ideas, to be in dialogue about critically important developments in education. And we use this as a kind of renewal in our community of thinking about how we can grow. So it's a very important moment for us, not just in having a public lecture, but in committing ourselves to really thinking deeply about our work. And so we're very proud to be able to do that in the company of someone that I think will carry us forward in that. So let me say a word about Pam Grossman. Her title today is Reimagining Teacher Education in a Shifting Landscape. This topic was very important to us, because we know as teacher educators that we're in a new landscape. It's been very important to her because she's been doing path-breaking work that's helping to define and lay out what some of those directions are. Pam Grossman is the Normalini Olivier Professor of Education at Stanford University School of Education. She completed her undergraduate degree in English at Yale University. And she told me, I think earlier this week, that when she went to Yale, she had decided already that she wanted to be a teacher and went through their teacher education program and launched an educational career from there. She did her Ph.D. at Stanford, and she's published very, very extensively in the areas of teacher education and more broadly, professional education, thinking about teacher knowledge and also the teaching of English in secondary schools. Her recent work, which has been of great interest to us being here in New York City, has been with the Pathways Project, which is a very, very large study of teachers and their educational backgrounds and their performance in New York City. In fact, it's one of the largest studies of its kind done at any time in the sort of the social science and teacher education history of education in this country. And one thing that she was really interested in, along with her colleagues, her co-principal investigators, is what are the characteristics of programs that help to produce high-performing students who learn well and who sustain that learning over time. She's also done very close, deep work on the practices of middle school English teachers and trying to see again how their practice, their teacher practice, interacts with student achievement. She's a member of the National Academy of Education, of which our president, Susan Furman, is the president. So we have a nice connection there. And she's currently the faculty director of the Center to Support Excellence in Teaching at Stanford. She's been a high school English teacher, so she knows what she's talking about. And she teaches pre-service English teachers at Stanford in the teacher education program. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Pam Grossman.
And I want to thank especially Susan and Tom for giving me the opportunity to come and spend this week in New York in a teacher's college. As Tom was saying, I've done a lot of research in New York, and so I've spent a lot of time over the last decade here. Luckily, I have 3 former college roommates who all live in New York, so to save the grants money, I often stay with them. But I'm really enjoying the apartment on Morningside Drive. The visit has provided me with the opportunity to really reflect on the past decade, because we began this work in 2002. And to think about this landscape of teacher education and the kinds of opportunities it affords us as teacher educators. I also want to thank whoever arranged for Joe's Coffee to move uptown. One of my college roommates lives in the West Village, and my daily routine would be to go to Joe's, get a cup of coffee, get on the subway, and go off and do my work. So it's very happy to see you here. Yes. I'm keenly aware that this is a difficult time to be a teacher and a teacher educator in this country, and more specifically in New York. I've spoken with a lot of teachers this week, demoralized by having their value-added course published in the paper. And teacher educators as well are feeling the pressure around accountability and being able to prove their impact on students' performance in the classroom. But I also think that times of crisis and challenge are times of opportunity. I'm going to do with the talk today, and roughly about a third of the time sketching out the shifting landscape of teacher education, using the pathway study to talk about some of that, and then the remaining time to talk about some directions and opportunities for reimagining teacher education in this same landscape. As Tom mentioned, I'm also a practicing teacher educator, in addition to being a researcher of teacher education. And I spend an enormous amount of time, half of my teaching load is actually in teacher education. And I spend a lot of time thinking about that methods course and how to organize it and how to best prepare secondary English teachers to be the best English teachers they can be in the schools in which they work. And I do this work very wholeheartedly because I believe it is central to the mission of a professional school. And I believe with Ken Zeichner that there's really, in some ways, no more important work for a professional school to be doing than, as he says, to do the best job that it possibly can in preparing teachers to teach in the schools of our nation and to support the learning of teachers throughout their careers, this is also central to the mission of Teachers College and many of the institutions at which you work. But he goes on to say, if we are not prepared to take this responsibility more seriously and do all that we can to have the best possible teacher education programs, then we should let somebody else do the job. And he said this back in 1999. And of course, part of what's happened in the intervening decade is that many other people have stepped up to do the job. So we're going to talk a little bit about these changes in the landscape of teacher education. And I'm going to focus obviously on New York because that's what we've been studying, but I think it's fair to say that these kinds of shifts are also occurring in large urban areas like Chicago, like LA, around the country. So, as I'm sure is no surprise to you, the landscape of teacher education in New York City is a very crowded one. When we started this project, and I want to acknowledge Carla Asher here and CUNY more generally because the Pathways Project was really initiated by CUNY. So CUNY came to my colleagues, Susanna Loeb and Jim Wyckoff, and said, you're doing all of this work on the teacher workforce in New York City, but nobody's doing that kind of work around teacher education. So could you begin to look at the pathways into teaching? And CUNY actually gave us the first seed money for that grant. So the history actually came from New York and the teacher education institutions here. So one of the things that when we started this, we looked at the New York State database to look at who was preparing the majority of teachers for New York City schools. And we identified about 25 institutions. 25. Oh, Susan's looking at me. Sure. Yes, and those only prepared about 60% of the teachers for New York City. And spoke with the institutions and ultimately ended studying 18 of those institutions. And when we started this work, that seems reasonable. 18, it's a lot, but still it's reasonable. Well, within every institution, there were dozens of programs. And we were looking at programmatic features, not institutional features. So suddenly, we weren't looking at 18 programs. We were looking at over 100, and my colleague Karen Hammerness was also part of this work. Karen is now at Bard, but was then a postdoctoral fellow with us at Stanford. And it was just, Karen remembers this, these spreadsheets of trying to keep track of all of these different programs. Because every institution was offering a wide range of programs in multiple certification areas. So most of the institutions we studied offered both undergraduate and graduate programs, and both elementary and secondary programs. At the secondary level, multiple certification areas, as well as special ed and the teaching of bilingual education, the teaching of English as a second language. There were a lot of programs within this. But the size of the programs varied pretty dramatically. So let's see if this actually works. Let's take a look at this. So 2,683 people certified in childhood education at all of these different institutions. And you can see some of the numbers along the side. Actually, that number is wrong. It's 140 secondary math certificates. 140. So you go from 2,000 to 140 math educators. So look at all the different institutions that are offering math certification. Every one of those programs had to find high quality placements and math educators, both of which are in short supply. So programs were actually competing with each other around some of these resources. Okay? The other thing to realize that was happening at this time is that New York got rid of the temporary license, right? So at around 2000. And the number of teachers were coming, a really large percentage of teachers were coming through the temporary license pathway. Once that pathway was eliminated, you needed other kinds of programs to fill that need. So let's take a look at the different providers who started coming in. I think this isn't going to be surprising to you. Teach for America, the New York City Teaching Fellows, who picked up a lot of the teachers who were coming through temporary license. CUNY created its own program, the Teaching Opportunity Program. You have the Peace Corps Fellows, as do other institutions. The Relay School of Education, Math for America, American Museum of Natural History. So you had more and more institutions joining an already pretty crowded landscape, right? So now you get the sense of this sort of multiplicity. But one of the things that's interesting, and many of you know this already, is that the universities are still very much a part of this picture here. Because universities were partnering with most of these alternative providers to offer those teacher education programs. So it wasn't brand new programs that were standalone. It was, in fact, university programs partnering with Teach for America, partnering with the New York City Teaching Fellows. So remember those multiple programs with the institutions. Now you have institutions that are not only providing the full array of more traditionally college-based teacher education programs, they're also offering New York City Teaching Fellows programs, TFA programs, top programs. So now you have institutions competing with themselves. So it's not really a case of us versus them, which has sometimes been portrayed as in the sort of pathway work, but really us versus us, because we were very much, teacher education institutions were very much involved in this as well. So let's take a look at what happened with the numbers and the teacher supply. So you can see in 2000, look at how many teachers are coming through the temporary license route. That's a huge number. When that goes away, you can see the growth. This is the New York City Teaching Fellows. And you can see how they're coming in to fill a lot of that. You can also see, it's worth noting here, that this is college recommending programs. Universities are still preparing most of the teachers. for New York City. They're still the major provider, and they actually increased their numbers until 2008, when the number of teachers being hired by New York City, you see they all go down in 2008. So you can begin to see kind of how these pathways interacted with one another, and also some of the institutional challenges of keeping up with all of this. One of the challenges of actually doing this research, and Karen knows this well, is every time we thought we had it, we thought we had finished, another program would pop up. It was just, trying to keep track of all those. Even though we were preparing more teachers, and you can see this change, New York was still not preparing enough secondary math teachers. So if you look at the picture around math teachers, it looks somewhat different. So what you'll see is that, again, those low numbers, the average number of teachers prepared in secondary math at any of those institutions you saw earlier was 6. Most institutions were producing about 6 secondary math teachers. So you can see who filled in the gap here was the New York City Teaching Fellows Math Immersion Program. So it was a variant, here's another alternative that we had to keep track of. It's an alternative to the regular math, the Teaching Fellows program, in that it takes people who don't necessarily have an undergraduate degree in math, gives them some extra math coursework, and that varies enormously by institution, with some institutions providing a lot of math coursework and others relatively minimal math coursework. And you can see, and then beginning to prepare them to be the math teachers. And they are now the single largest, you can see it there, the single largest provider of secondary math teachers in New York City.
Where's MFA in this?
MFA started a little bit later, and we don't have them on this chart. We actually have studied MFA though. Yeah. So we'll see that. Okay. So you can see that the landscape is shifting a little bit. New providers are coming in and doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Once again, universities are still, college recommending programs are still providing, next to the teaching fellows, a lot of the math teachers, and some of that was in fact due to Math for America. So you can see the numbers in those university-based courses go up when they have the Math for America programs. Okay. So one of the challenges of this landscape, as you can imagine, is ensuring quality across all of these different programs. Every one of these programs has to find field placements. They have to find high-quality instructors. They're competing not only with other programs within their own institution, but with other institutions in New York over good cooperating teachers. These are all things that are scarce resources. So what we have is a crowded and somewhat competitive landscape here. But when we looked at the outcomes and looked at the curriculum and looked at the outcomes of these different programs, despite the multiplicity, despite the proliferation, there was remarkable similarity. You didn't really see huge differences across these programs in terms of what they required or what they offered. Now, some of that is because of the requirements of New York State. So New York State actually has very high requirements around teacher education and holds the same set of requirements for both college recommending and alternative routes. So everybody has to more or less take similar courses, they just might be taking them at different times. So in part, it's a policy environment that constrains variation. And so you see that in this. But they're also actually relatively similar in terms of outcomes. So when you look at the graduates of these programs and see their impact on student achievement scores, what you notice is that most of those programs cluster around 0. There's a whole set that cluster around, and there are a few that are producing graduates who have the impact of second-year teachers, who are really having a major impact. And many of those programs are doing that both in math and in ELA. Some programs are good in math, but not in ELA. There's the reverse. And there are at least 1 or 2 programs who are actually producing graduates who have negative impact on student achievement. So you see a lot of clustering, you see a few institutions and programs that stand out. But what you mostly see in some ways is a lot of similarity, not a lot of programs that are very distinctive in terms of the features that we capture. One of the most fascinating parts of the study for me as a teacher educator actually had to do with the teacher educator workforce. Because we kept track of who was teaching the courses. We kept track of who was teaching the math methods, the ELA methods courses, the learning and development courses, so both foundational courses and methods courses. We asked the institutions for who was actually teaching those courses. We also had NK documents, and we traced down where these people were prepared. Thank goodness for Google, is all I can say. Google has changed how you can do research and track people. And we had a group that we couldn't figure out where they came from, and so we did even more deep digging around them. And we learned a lot of interesting things about the teacher-educator workforce. First of all, we learned that the majority of people teaching those courses are adjuncts. They are not tenure-line faculty. That probably doesn't surprise you. That also includes doctoral students, by the way, that adjunct. But the majority, over 63% of the people teaching the learning course, which surprised me a little bit, and over half of the math and ELA methods courses. This is across institutions. The other thing that really surprised me was that over half of the 80 faculty that we looked at came from one of the 6 institutions we were studying. So they were being prepared locally. We also discovered some people who were teaching as adjuncts at multiple institutions. So their names kept cropping up. We'd see them, in one place, and then we'd see them at another place, and then we began to realize that these are the kind of traveling adjuncts. Only more than 1/3 of all of the faculty teaching those courses who had doctorates were prepared at 1 of 2 institutions. And as many of you already guessed, your Teachers College is one of those institutions. That's preparing a large number of the teacher educators for New York City. That's incredible, because that represents a tremendous opportunity for changing the landscape, and one I'm going to come back to later. So, having outlined the terrain, and you can read all more about this and all the charts and all the statistics if you're interested, I'm going to turn now to what some of the opportunities that are provided by this. As I mentioned earlier, times of crisis also represent times of opportunity. And I think this is one of those times. But I want to issue a couple of caveats. The first is that I want to focus specifically in this talk on the role that universities can play in reimagining teacher education. I think there is a role for universities in teacher education, despite the press that we're feeling right now. I also want to focus on educating teachers who are prepared for the long haul. To paraphrase our president, creating an educational system that is built to last will require teachers who are well prepared not just for the short-term challenges that they face, but also for the long haul. So I want to focus on that. And third, reimagining teacher education will require us to stop thinking in either-or terms and to dismantle some of the dichotomies that have defined our field. And in many ways, I can't imagine a better place to be talking about perils of either-or thinking than in Teachers College, where Dewey spirit still reigns. So I think remembering that when we talk about the kinds of opportunities that exist, these are opportunities that, again, require boundary crossing. Require us to work across some of the divisions. So, with those caveats in mind, let's think a little bit about what some of the opportunities might be. The first one might be heretical. prune programs. I know this is not an easy thing for universities to hear, but as we were doing this work, we just began to feel like there are just too many programs. And not just for us to study. There are just so many programs that, as I mentioned before, it's hard to keep the quality when you are trying to staff that many programs. And when you have that many small programs, because as I said, I showed you the example of secondary math, but there were other programs that were also quite small. Pruning programs goes against, I think, the ethos of a university, which is always, about growing and sprawling. And it would require a fair amount of self-discipline and also self-sacrifice, because of course, faculty are attached to the programs they teach. I feel the same way. So it's not an easy recommendation, but I think offering fewer programs at higher quality would allow institutions to really reimagine their work in teacher education. Again, you can imagine that identifying areas of strength, maybe it's preparing inclusive elementary teachers. Maybe it's preparing humanities teachers who have dual certification in both English and social studies history. Maybe it's preparing those secondary math teachers who, need preparation programs. But what that allows us to do is to think about gathering resources and investing in those programs and really making them the best possible teacher education programs of its kind. Again, I think private universities have a particular kind of opportunity to do that, but public systems, like the City of University of New York, also have that kind of opportunity to think through, maybe not every college will offer the same range of programs. Maybe we really think that Hunter is going to be the place to study one thing, and City would be the place to study something else. That allows us to really be disciplined about gathering those resources and investing in those programs. The second proposal is one that's very near and dear to my heart and is related to a lot of the other research I was doing at the same time. As I was saying to one group this week, not only was I running the pathway study, I'd also at exactly the same time gotten a grant to study the teaching of clergy, clinical psychologists, and teachers. And that work was sort of the opposite of this other work of that going into those programs, spending a lot of time. It was very qualitative. It was a great study. Doing the two studies at the same time, a little crazy, but in fact, they actually came together. And the way that they came together is that when we were looking at this cross-professional work, one of the things I got very interested in was how you prepare people for relational practice. How do you prepare people for practice in which the work you do depends on the client, right? Teachers can't do their work by themselves. They need the students to come along with them. Therapists definitely can't do the work by themselves, right? So studying these different professions made me realize that other professional schools, particularly clinical psychology, didn't take any of that for granted. They really targeted practices that they knew made a difference in terms of the quality of therapy. So one of the things that they found in clinical psychology is the quality of the therapeutic alliance that a therapist establishes with a client is one of the most important factors affecting the efficacy of any treatment. And it turns out if you have it, many treatments work. If you don't have it, nothing works. So I was thinking as well about in some ways, the foundational practices of teaching. How can we begin to organize teacher education around these core practices that help define our field? One of the critiques of teacher education by graduates and employers alike has been that teachers are not sufficiently well prepared for the work that they're doing pretty much on day one, because our profession still asks people to do the same work on day one as a very experienced professional would do. Just as an aside, it turns out that law firms have exactly the same complaint about law schools. I was invited to a conference on building better lawyers, and they were all complaining that law school doesn't really prepare people for practice as well. So we're not alone in this particular thing. But one of the things that's happened in universities is we moved more towards foundational and theoretical knowledge. It's the move from the normal school to the university and away from practice. And part of the press of many of these alternative programs has been, again, toward practice, of making teacher education more practical. So one way to reimagine teacher education is to organize teacher education not by disciplines, not by departments, not by areas, but instead around core practices, where the practice of teaching provide the warp threads and the theory and knowledge and skill that you need to enact those practices becomes the weft. So those things are tightly woven together. One of the most unhelpful dichotomies in our field, and one that Dewey wrote very eloquently about, is between theory and practice. It's just not a helpful dichotomy. And sometimes the press towards the practice can leave theory behind, just as the press towards theory can leave practice behind. So in reimagining teacher education, I really think that we need to think about how to bring those things together. So one core practice I spend a lot of time teaching my novice secondary teachers is how to lead an intellectually engaging classroom discussion. Nothing could be more ubiquitous in the teaching of English than discussion. And yet when we surveyed teacher education programs in the state of California, only 2 programs had leading the discussion in their curriculum. It's shocking to me because that's what we expect people to do when they go out into the field. And one of the things we found, of course, is that people are not well prepared to do that. It's more than technique. It requires more than technique. It requires knowing what the purposes of a good discussion are, knowing what students can learn from the discussion, knowing how to track learning through talk, knowing how to listen to student thinking, knowing the subject, so you can map that. There's a lot involved in the practice of leading a good discussion. And part of the work of teacher education should be preparing people well for those fundamentals of practice. There's another thing that universities bring to the table, and that is they're research universities. They engage in research and scholarship. But much of that research is not necessarily responsive to the needs of practitioners. And here I'm saying practitioners all up and down the system, including teacher educators. So Susan and I had the, and Carnes all had the dubious pleasure of serving on the AERA consensus panel on research and teacher education, where we were trying to look at what do we know about a whole set of questions that are really actually fundamental to our field. And it took us 800 pages to conclude not as much as we should. So one of the things that the university should be doing as part of reimagining teacher education is doing research that's responsive to those needs, that can answer questions that are just, again, fundamental to our work, but we don't necessarily know the answer to. We just wrote a chapter on field experience, and questions like, and they wanted us to answer questions like, what's the optimal amount of student teaching? Who knows? Our study said no student teaching is bad, but that's about it. That's not very helpful guidance. One of my former students, Matt Ronfeld, who worked on both the pathway study and the cross-professional study, the only student who was crazy enough to work on both of these with me, is now at the University of Michigan. And he's done some work, additional work on the Pathways project, looking at the characteristics of schools in which we place students, and whether or not the schools make a difference in terms of both teacher impact on student achievement and retention. This has been a topic of discussion at AERA as long as I've been going to AERA. There have been many panels about what kind of schools should we place. Should we put them in the highest poverty, highest need schools to help them experience that and learn what's that like so they'll be more likely to be effective later? Or should we put them in more functioning schools so they could concentrate on learning to teach? Well, Matt did the first piece of empirical work I actually know on this, large-scale empirical work, where he looked, we had, one of the things we collected is actually schools where everybody did their ski teaching. So he looked at whether or not he placed a school that was better functioning, and it was better functioning meant that there was lower turnover in that school. Made a difference compared to being put in a school that was less well functioning as measured again by high teacher turnover. And he found out that actually there's quite a substantial, significant effect of being placed in a well functioning school. It was an effect both on their impact on student achievement once they left teacher education and on retention. They were much more likely to stay in teaching, and that held even when they went to teach in a low-functioning school with high teacher turnover. That's the kind of research we need to be doing more of. That's the kind of research that as teacher educators we can use in making the decisions about our programs. So doing the research that's responsive to the profession is, again, part of what the university can be doing. Beginning to really create innovations and then study those and look at the differential impact of different kinds of programs, similar to what we did in Pathways, will help us understand, is this a good innovation? Is this really having the kinds of impact we imagine? And finally, and you know this was coming, the other thing that we could be doing is preparing outstanding teacher educators, because reimagining teacher education is going to require a whole new generation of teacher educators. Just as there's an assumption that anyone can teach, there's a corresponding assumption that if you've taught, you can be a teacher educator. Yes. and one of the things that we've seen when we looked at all of the people who were teaching these teacher education programs is many of them had no preparation to be teacher educators. They were there and they had been teachers, and so they became back to teacher educators. In fact, when I was doing the study after the Pathway study, I was we had hired some graduate students from CUNY actually to help us. And many of them were working in multiple institutions in the city, working as teacher educators. So as a field, I would argue that we need to take the preparation of teacher educators much more seriously. Because just as we know the teacher matters, the teacher educator matters. It's not just the curriculum, it's who's teaching the curriculum and how well they're prepared to really support student learning. I think Teachers College can play an incredibly important role in that reimagination and in that preparation of teacher educators. And you can do it across sectors, because it's not just the people who are being prepared for the university-based programs that are in your doctoral programs, it's also people who are being prepared to teach at places like Relay or Teach for America. They're coming to places like Teachers College. And I think we have a responsibility to ensure that they're well prepared. The rigorous, intentional preparation of teacher educators could include, again, learning about the foundations of the work. Again, studying some of the Dewey's piece on the theory and practice of teacher education is still the best piece I know of about some of this. Helping them really learn what the research says and the nature of teacher education in a higher ed or non-higher ed landscape. It also, though, involves the practice of teacher education. Helping people understand more about the pedagogy of teacher education, how to enact it successfully, how to supervise, how to support teacher learning. There's a huge array of things that teacher educators need to know, and the university can play, I think, a really important role in doing that work. So, in conclusion, I want to return to the theme of times of change as times of opportunity. I know it's difficult times, but I actually remain quite optimistic about the potential for teacher education and the role of the university in teacher education. And I hope it's not just because I'm basically an optimistic person, because I was socialized into skepticism, right, as we all are when we become academics. So, the fact that my optimism is persevering must mean something. when I think about the change that I see in our field, I think actually about the history of surgery. So some of you may have read Atul Gawande's piece on the history of surgery and surgical practice after World War II. And it was an incredibly fertile time where there was a lot of experimentation, a lot of change, and sort of an explosion of new techniques in the field. Or some of you may have read The Emperor of All Maladies, which is the history of cancer, and again looked at the steady production of new knowledge about how to treat cancer, and the competing theories about how best to do it, and the more nuanced understanding that led to different targeted therapies when they realized, well, you couldn't treat all cancer in the same way. I think we're at a time right now in the fields of teaching and teacher education where we're seeing a similar kind of explosion around tools and data. Data may be a mixed blessing when it gets into the New York Times, but in terms of learning more about what we do and using that data to inform our practice and doing research that's consequential for our work, data is a blessing. The kinds of tools that are being developed now to observe teachers and to collect more information about the quality of teaching, those also will enable us to do our work. And I think there's a willingness to experiment right now. You certainly see that willingness to experiment in New York City. So there's lots of experimentation going on. So I think the conditions are right for learning. If we dig into the work, refuse to engage in the kind of either-or thinking that's characterized some of the conversation, learn to be nimble, and I know that's not always easy for universities, and particularly large universities and colleges, and learn from our mistakes. So I want to close with a quote from my colleague Ray McDermott, who seems to capture the spirit of what it would take to reimagine teacher education in a shifting landscape. Look carefully. Challenge your own categories. Talk with people on all sides of perceived divisions. Try to make change. Count what you doubt. Doubt what you count. Try new categories. Sounds like great, doesn't it? Look more deeply. Make more change when possible. And start the cycle again. Thank you.
I'm going to let Pam rest her voice for just a minute before she takes questions and remind you that we are going to be opening these doors. There'll be a reception. This will be in a few minutes, so don't run away and we can continue our conversation. I'm sure that she'd be very happy to engage in dialogue or receive questions or comments.
Sure. Comments, questions? Yes.
Pam, I really enjoyed your talk. It was really spectacular. I had a question. My name is Paula Rosa. We actually spoke a few moments ago. You mentioned the 4 Ps in your talk just now. And you're the 5th P, actually. But my question is about yet another P, and that's the word passion. How can we instill passion in the teachers that are coming, with the ones that are there? Because without that passion, a teacher cannot have the effect on the child, no matter how much knowledge that teacher has.
Well, passion is clearly an important ingredient. It's was a large body of research on teacher characteristics, and one of the characteristics that was most predictive of student achievement in that work was teacher enthusiasm. So I think that kind of enthusiasm and passion. I actually think a lot of people come into teaching with that passion. And so I think one of the questions is, how do we support teachers and nourish teachers and invest in them so they can maintain that passion? So I don't see a circuit of passion coming in. I think the question is, how do we keep it alive, and how do we create conditions where people can really continue to learn and continue to be passionate about their work.
Can you give us the example of nourishing teacher?
Well, as Tom mentioned, I actually now run a center. It's called the Center to Support Excellence in Teaching. When I came to Stanford, one of the things that I noticed was that there were no teachers there in the summer. It was just sort of shocking to me, coming from the University of Washington, where we had lots and lots of teachers there in the summer. And one of the things that we've started doing is to run a wide variety of professional development programs for teachers as you do here in many of your other institutions. Many of them were modeled after a studio model, with the notion that just like artists, teachers need studios. They need the resources, they need the time, they need the colleagues to do the kind of design work that's fundamental to teaching. So we run programs that go for 2 weeks. We work with colleagues across the university. They have an opportunity to just take in a lot of the Stanford resources and get nourished and really begin to recover their excitement around teaching. Right now I'm doing another project with middle school English teachers in San Francisco, which again is designed to give people the time and opportunities to continue to learn. Teaching is hard work, and it's relentless work, and having that time to sort of recover and rejuvenate is incredibly important. Yes?
So just thinking about the research portion of your recommendations, it seems to me that education research is more readily dismissed or ignored than research in, say, traditional sciences. And so I'm wondering, what the role of the university and the community at large is in making sure that education research is seen as credible and is utilized effectively.
That's a great question. I mean, it's certainly something that the National Academy of Education has been very interested in, and a number of people trying to think about the status of educational research. I think that's shifting a little bit, and I'd be curious to think about how somebody like Hank thinks about this. But I think that a lot of educational research right now actually is being paid attention to and is credible. I think part of the issue is that we need to police ourselves and make sure that the quality is really good. Part of it, I think, again, the kind of work that I did with Pathways, I could never have done alone. I never could have done that alone. I was very glad that I took the required statistics courses when I was a graduate student at Stanford. And I've always thanked my regression teacher, Ingram Olkin, for the record, for helping me understand regression. But, I'm not an economist. I couldn't have done that work. But I would argue they couldn't have done the work without me, because they didn't understand teacher education. So it's also building those partnerships. Again, going against the dichotomies that divide us to be able to do that work that makes for better research. And I think that preparing doctoral students in both quantitative and qualitative methods is part of that. In our field right now, everybody needs to be able to at least have a basic literacy in both of those. Yes?
You suggested that we reorganize in terms of core skills or principles. Is there some other profession that we could look at if that model currently exists?
That's a really good question. If you look at the training of doctors, there are a set of practices that everybody has to master, right? And one of the things I talk about in my work in the teaching of practice is you've actually got to decompose the practice, right? It's learning to lead a classroom discussion includes a lot of different things. And so somewhere I have some slides about what it means to do a physical exam. It has a lot of different things. And people actually have to be checked off on some of those things. So I think there are. Clinical psychology, as I mentioned, is another one where there's a lot of emphasis, again, on teaching basic skills for developing empathy, which again might be something that we think you would select for, but because you can't take it for granted, they teach it. And it's really, we saw all of the programs that we studied.
I find my foundation is psychology. And I find that without that, I would be nothing. I'd be withering on the floor, working how I work now. And I think that psychology is so important, but I find that it's not incorporated in the practices or the understanding of what it is to be a teacher and a student-teacher relationship.
So I think that's a great question. One of the divisions that we have to undo is the division between foundations and methods courses. That's also been an unhelpful way in many ways to think about preparation of teachers. I agree with you. Principles of learning are critical. Principles of adolescence, right? If you're going to work with adolescents, I remember I ran a middle school teacher education program at the University of Washington and co-taught with an educational psychologist who specialized in early adolescence. And I taught middle school students. And my jaw just dropped and said, really, this is all completely normal. I should just something wrapped around practice. So I was telling the story about a good friend of mine who teaches adolescent development. Again, I think a critically important course. And her students said, you know, I love this course. I love this course. I look forward to it every time. But I can't figure out why we're studying it. So that's the responsibility of the teacher educators, to make sure that people understand how that is related to the work we do in the classrooms. So listening to students, understanding kind of student behavior, all of that is wrapped up in some of these core practices around establishing classroom culture, around leading a discussion. But you've got to make, in some ways, that knowledge usable for practice. Yes?
Yes, I want to build on the question about passion of teachers. What's your initial sense of the relationship between the test-based evaluation of teachers, aside from the publication tag, the relationship between that strategy that we're using today and the passion and the relationship building and the soulfulness and the inspirational nature of teaching?
You know, I think that teaching is multidimensional. And I think that this whole discussion right now on teacher evaluation is beginning to recognize the multidimensional nature of the work. And the fact that any single measure is probably not sufficient to capture the range of teaching. One of the things that's interesting is that right now, a lot of the discussion is how well do all of these different measures correlate with value added. But you wouldn't expect them, if they're picking up different dimensions of teaching, you might not expect them to correlate with value added, right? That's not what they're correlating with. Maybe what you should look at, I sometimes talk about the Jack Herrera effect. Jack Herrera was my high school orchestra teacher. He was the most passionate person you could imagine, and he was passionate about good music teaching. We recently had our anniversary of my high school orchestra that had actually traveled to Japan to perform at Expo, playing Stravinsky. And we all got on our instruments and tried to play it again, many, many years later. But what I call the Jack Herrera effect is when I looked around that reunion, I would say that a third of the people were either professional musicians or music educators. You would never predict that from a high school. So that's a different kind of impact that a teacher has that isn't going to be captured necessarily in value added, is what do those kids go on to do.
You have been talking about preparing outstanding teacher educator. What is the key challenge or opportunity of today's teacher educators?
The key challenge facing teacher educators? That's a great question. I would say that one of the challenges is we have very limited time. Going back to the study that I was doing, this cross-professional study, I was only studying graduate programs. So in every instance, people already had a BA when they came into the professional school. It took 4 or 5 years to prepare a clergy member. It takes 4 years to prepare a clinical psychologist. We get 1 year to prepare a teacher. And I actually think that's a huge challenge, is to figure out how do you use limited time well. Because you're not, that's a very limited horizon within which to prepare people. So one of the questions, I think, is what do you focus on, given that limited time? Again, it requires that kind of pruning and self-discipline. There's many things I might like to do, but really, there are probably only 5 things I can do in my method class. So what are those going to be? So I think thinking through, how do you prepare well-launched beginners who can walk into classrooms and enact some of those practices with some degree of skill, and at the same time, make sure that the foundations are there for continuing learning, right? Because they're going to have to continue learning, and we know that teachers continue learning through those early years. So how do you balance those two agendas? I think that's a big challenge facing teacher educators.
Hi. What would you say would be the role, then, to build off of that, of a teacher educator and helping beginning teachers internalize the variety of curriculum there is in schools?
You know, one of the reasons that I talk about the core practices is that in our work around English language arts, we try to identify practices that cut across curriculum. So one of the practices that I focus on in my methods class is modeling. And whether or not you're teaching open core or you're teaching Reader's Writer's Workshop, you're probably going to have to be able to model reading, model writing processes. So one of the, because I think that is again another huge challenge for teacher educators, is that very few of us are preparing people for a single system, right? So you have to prepare them to walk into lots of different kinds of curriculum. It's much easier if you have what some people call a curricular regime, where you know you're preparing them for the writer's workshop or for Fountas and Pam L, and you can prepare them for those particular practices. But I do think identifying those practices that are going to be useful across a different array of curriculum, and then also helping them, this is one thing I don't think we do enough of as teacher educators, is to prepare people to learn how to use curriculum materials well. Many of us, in fact, in teacher education are a little bit skeptical, going back to our skepticism, about the quality of curriculum, and yet curricula are professional tools, and teachers need to learn how to use those professional tools in their work. So spending more time, one of the things that was predictive, one of the features of teacher education that was predictive of student achievement was the opportunity to study the curriculum of New York City or the standards of New York State. It was also rare. Not many programs actually had people study those things. But being able to really sort of think through, now, New York has so many curricula, I'm not exactly sure how they interpreted that, but it meant that at some point they had the opportunity to think about curriculum and to think about how to use curriculum to teach. And I think that's a valuable opportunity.
In some of your work over the years, Pam, you've given focus to things beyond the classroom as part of both teacher preparation and preparation of teacher educators. Today, for a variety of reasons, including the questions that were raised, you focus mainly on the teacher as a classroom practitioner. I was recently in Cuba where I was told that pedagogical institutes, pedagogical universities, part of the supervision that the teacher educators do is actually about relations with parents and how teachers visit homes and how teachers...
Being able to build relationships both with students and their families is very important. University of Michigan has developed a set of high leverage practices, and communicating with parents is one of those practices. And again, thinking through how you help beginning teachers communicate with parents. Some programs do require home visits. So again, that's part of the practice that they're trying to develop, is to reach out into the community. Other institutions like University of Washington actually have placements in community-based organizations, not just in classrooms. University of Pennsylvania did that as well. So when you first come into the program, you start in a community-based organization to learn about the community. And it's a community where the school you'll be teaching at is. So you learn a lot about the community, and you also get to know kids in a different context outside of school, which I think is incredibly valuable. So you can see the full learning characteristics. So that's an excellent point, and that is one of those core practices. I did need to explain that.
I want to take advantage of this pause as moderator to do two things. One is to say that our conversations will continue. I'm really hoping that there's some food behind that door.